Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. We're late for an utterly unimportant date. The top 10 games of 2016 should have come out last year. But it didn't. Whoops. Sorry about that. Better late than never, right? Yeah. Anyway, that's not the title of the video in the first place. It's my top 10 games of 2016. And that's based on the same criteria it is every year. These are the top 10 games that I enjoyed playing in 2016. All of these lists are very subjective, of course. We just don't pretend this one is in any way definitive or based on anything else other than subjective enjoyment. Some people like to make top 10s and they like to try and take into account other things. That's cool. I'm just not into that. Not really a fan of it. I'd rather give my own personal list. That's what this is every year. It's a little tradition on YouTube. Makes a decent amount of money, although not in bloody January it doesn't, good lord. You see, this is why it's bad that I was late on it. Regardless, I'm going to give you the top 10 games that I enjoyed in 2016. I'm also going to spend a good amount of time telling you why I think that. So, without further ado, let's begin. My top 10 games of 2016. Number 10. SteamWorld Heist. The second big SteamWorld title of the company Image and Form is one that I enjoyed far more than their first. They started off this little franchise and universe of theirs with something called SteamWorld Tower Defense back in 2010, which is a little DSiWare title, but the first major title in the franchise was SteamWorld Dig, which was a game about mining, platforming, making money. It was pretty cool, actually. It had a very nice art style. It just wasn't necessarily my sort of game, and I didn't play a huge amount of it as a result of that. But they decided to create another title in the SteamWorld franchise that was fundamentally different, something that had completely different mechanics and ideas and really resembled the first game only in terms of the kind of characters that it has and the particular aesthetic and art style. See, both these games feature steampunky kind of robots, as you might imagine. In this case, those steampunky kind of robots are in space, and they're doing steampunky pirate robot kind of things. And in terms of the way it plays, the best comparison, I think, would be something of an amalgamation of XCOM and Worms. This is a game about turn-based combat with a squad of pirate robots who you can gear up as you so choose, level up and gain new abilities. But there is an element of aiming involved in it that goes far beyond most turn-based tactical combat games. In that particular genre, if you can call it that, you're usually dealing with some sort of probability-based combat system. Your chance to hit is determined by stats and a roll of virtual dice. That's what most games in the genre do anyway, but in this case, what you've got is a manual aiming system that is reliant on your personal ability as a player to aim, as opposed to a dice roll and stats of the character. The bullets go exactly where they should based on where you shot them. And the way that it does this is by drawing a line from your weapon to the target and having you carefully aim around obstacles and over cover and make sure that your timing is on point, because the weapon itself shakes backwards and forwards, which affects where the bullet will actually strike. That means that there is an element of timing, skill, patience, and to some degree a bit of calculation, especially with weapons that don't have laser sights that tell you where the bullet's going to go. What makes this even more interesting is the fact that most shots in the game actually ricochet off of walls. So it's very possible to create trick shots that will hit multiple surfaces and then eventually strike your target. And trying to figure out exactly whether or not you can do that with a particular shot is part of what makes the combat very interesting. Now, you take that and you amalgamate it with an interesting progression system for the robots when it comes to the things like the acquisition of gear and usable cooldown-based skills, and tactical decision-making as to which enemy to shoot. And you've got a very compelling little genre masher that is really well presented and very, very responsive. Not something that's usually all that important with a turn-based game, as opposed to something that's in real time, but I have to admire the snappiness of it, the fact that as soon as you strike the key, there is an instantaneous response. It just makes the game a little bit more enjoyable to play. It's by no means essential to it, but I like pointing it out anyway because I think it's a nice little plus and a nice little bit of polish that doesn't necessarily exist in other games in the genre. Add to that a nice meaty single-player campaign with plenty of content and choices to make, in which you start with a very small crew and low levels and terrible gear, and gather new crew for your ship, buy better guns, armor, and equipment, and take on progressively harder enemies and ships. And you've got a single-player experience that is very engrossing, will eat a good amount of time, and does have a certain degree of replayability going on with it. The additional DLC that's been added to the game on PC is excellent, and some of you might be thinking this is not a 2016 game, this came out in 2015. That's correct, but only on the 3DS platform. It only more recently came to PC, and was also, even more recently, ported to mobile devices, which is also an ideal platform for the title. It controls really well on there too, and it's a great game for your phone or tablet as much as it is for your home computer. Aesthetically, it's really great too. I do love the steampunk robot space cowboy aesthetic that they've got going on there, and they augment that with some really great music, some awesome audio and writing, and the whole thing is a really well-defined, high-definition, colorful title that looks great. The enemy design is absolutely fantastic. I love the way that the robots look in this game. In particular, one of the very early enemies, which is just a straight-up evil space pirate robot with a hook arm. It just looks fantastic. It's got a nice little cartoony feel to it, but it's just really well drawn, really well animated. It looks awesome. It's fantastic to see the robots falling into piles of scrap metal when you place a really good shot. And it's tactically satisfying as well, which is not necessarily something I expected. It's a very simple game to play. It's a very snappy game to play. It doesn't really have a very high learning curve, but it does require a good amount of skill, especially on the harder and elite challenge ships. Throw into that a bunch of obstacles, different win conditions, optional objectives, and a really compelling loot system that can generate some absolutely awesome guns with multiple different effects, as well as some interesting choices when it comes to what to arm your crew with. And you've got a really good little tactics game here with that far more unique artillery-like aspect when it comes to the manual aiming. It's a really awesome game. I'd recommend it on PC or on mobile device. Hell, even play it on 3DS where it originally came out. It's on quite a few different formats. It runs well on all of them, and it plays well on all of them too. I'm very much looking forward to seeing where they go with the SteamWorld universe. I love this idea of maybe making fairly unconnected games in different genres, but sticking to the same sort of theme and aesthetic, so there's a loose tie between them. I think that's pretty cool, and hopefully we'll be able to see another great title coming from Image and Form sometime in the future. Number 9. Offworld Trading Company is an interesting little title that has a fairly unique spin on real-time strategy. It's not really a genre that's had an awful lot of titles, certainly not high-profile ones over the last few years, but this game, from the lead designer of Civilization 4, was released by a new development company called Mohawk, and it takes an economic approach to the idea of real-time strategy. That doesn't make it any less cutthroat or aggressive. That's maybe the first misconception that people have when they hear that it's an economic game. The idea is, oh, all right, well, that's just a nice little laid-back management title. There's no stress going to be involved in that. Oh, you could not be more wrong. There is just as much competition and just as much cutthroat behavior to be found in Offworld Trading Company as there would be in a more traditional real-time strategy with tanks, laser beams, and infantrymen. You may not be able to directly attack your enemy, but there are plenty of ways to do it indirectly, whether it be manipulating the market, taking a monopoly over important resources, or engaging in direct sabotage through the use of the in-game black market. Offworld Trading Company is a completely cutthroat economic expansion game based on Mars, in which you can lose very, very quickly, and it requires not only a good deal of planning, but a reasonable amount of speed as well. You can't simply sit around waiting for your opponent to make a move. If you don't take control of those important resources and start production right now, you could find yourself bought out by the opposition, which is the main way to lose the game. What I find interesting about that is that despite the lack of direct violence, there are plenty of easy comparisons to make to violent RTS. The focus on build orders is a great example of that. This game is quite build order dependent, although you do have to adapt very much to the randomly generated maps, which does put a nice little spin on that. Not to mention the idea that the developer decided to reward both those that made the first move and those that made later moves with different advantages. If you make the move first, then you can grab the optimal piece of land first. You can grab those big, important resources first. But if you decide to wait a little bit, construction costs go down and you have a better idea of the lay of the land. You're able to scan more, discover more of the map, and perhaps make a better decision. I think it's really cool that the developer was able to provide benefits to both approaches, even though there is still a speed requirement to the game. You can't just sit around doing nothing. You do have to eventually take some actions, otherwise you will lose. Once the game gets going, though, things get very frantic indeed. You grab resource points on the map, you start gathering the resources you need to upgrade your headquarters, to research new exclusive technology, which only you can gain access to, and build up to an economic powerhouse of a company which can dominate the rest of your competition simply by making enough money to buy them out entirely. This can be done in a variety of different ways, by selling a variety of different products, as well as sabotaging your opponents and manipulating the market. The game has a big focus on decision making because you have a limited number of hexes on the map that you can lay claim to. As you level up your HQ, you're able to unlock more claims, plus you can buy claims as they occasionally become available in bidding wars during the game itself. But you can't simply take every resource. You can't expand everywhere, and you can't build tons of every building. You've got to make a choice, you've got to pick a strategy, and then you have to commit to it. And you only have a certain degree of adaptability when the situation changes. This again is a cornerstone of pretty much all high-level RTS play. Decision-making is super important. The misconception that a game like, say, StarCraft is just all about speed and not about the strategy and decisions is a prevalent one, and one that continues to fester to this very day, but in reality that decision-making is incredibly vital, and simply because Off-World Trading Company doesn't require 300 actions a minute doesn't mean that it's not a game that requires a degree of speed or an awful lot of savvy decisions. In fact, you could argue maybe a little bit more than some other real-time strategies because of those limited claim spots that you can make. The single-player experience is now well fleshed out with an interesting campaign in which you can hire specialists, get exclusive rights to certain things, and gradually upgrade your capabilities and technology across the course of a large campaign. It is actually possible to lose a map and continue the campaign. It affects the health of your company, of course, and eventually you will lose after you fail too many chances, but you can keep going, which I find to be really interesting. It does make the game a little bit daunting initially upon starting the campaign because you don't necessarily know what the right choices are, and it might take a good few playthroughs to really get that down. That's going to happen both in the campaign play and in a single game as well. As I said, build orders matter in all RTS, and they are very important here, and that applies to both the in-between mission upgrade your company level layer of it and the in-game minute-to-minute decision-making as well. The game also has an absolute ton of maps. It's got randomly generated maps as well. It has a fully functional multiplayer, which is highly enjoyable to play, especially if you get the right group of cutthroat players to play it with, and it has a daily challenge, which is fantastic because it provides a reason to go back on a day-to-day basis to compete for the highest score with online leaderboards in a specific challenge with a unique rule set. Off-World Trading Company is a very interesting and different take on the real-time strategy genre, and despite its lack of violence, that doesn't make it any less of a competitive real-time strategy experience. It is far from boring, and it is certainly perhaps way more stressful than you might originally imagine when you hear the term economic strategy game. But trust me when I say this is by no means your laid-back management game, and if you have a little bit of a competitive cutthroat streak in you and you fancy yourself being the CEO of a ruthless Martian mining company, this is the game in which to play out that fantasy. Number 8. Battlefleet Gothic. This has not been a good year for Warhammer 40,000 titles, unfortunately. Games Workshop decided to throw open the doors to their IP and let any Tom, Dick, and Harry have at it, it seems, and that has not resulted in a bevy of great games for a much-beloved universe. On PC in 2016, we suffered through the aborted MMO attempt that was Eternal Crusade that ended up being a, at best, extremely mediocre third-person multiplayer shooter, and an attempt at Space Hulk by the name of Deathwing, which unfortunately not only doesn't play all that well, but runs absolutely terribly. It's easy to forget that Carnage Champions also came out in 2016 on PC, because basically nobody played it, and you should forget it, because there is no other value in it. However, regardless of all of these failed attempts at utilizing the universe, we did get one game that did an incredible job of utilizing the universe and also created a very mechanically sound title indeed, and that went by the name of Battlefleet Gothic. Coming out earlier in 2016, released by Tindalos Interactive, who were a developer behind the unfortunately ill-fated space-based Dota-esque title Stellar Impact a few years ago. This is a very competent tactics and strategy game that is based on future fleet combat in space. The best way to describe this would be tall ships in the 41st millennium. These ships are generally quite slow, they're relatively large, cumbersome and unwieldy, and yet armed to the teeth with batteries and batteries of broadside weapons, as well as spacefaring torpedoes. The massive lumbering capital craft available in this game encourage a rather thoughtful style of play. You have to maneuver in advance of something that is going to happen later on, particularly when dealing with the torpedo-like weapons, which of course have travel time and must be manually aimed ahead of your target. Careful maneuvers to maximize the firepower and the effectiveness of the weapons on your ships while minimizing the fire that the enemy can bring to bear is of paramount importance. So this is more of a graceful tactical title that's a little bit slower paced than a good number of real-time tactics or strategy games that you would find. The campaign involves playing a newly minted Imperial commander who starts with a small Dauntless light cruiser, and eventually working your way up to the huge Emperor-class battleship while dealing with a campaign map in which you are able to fail, but it will have significant consequences to your career going forward. You earn resources to upgrade your ships, your commanders will level up and gain new abilities, and become more effective at their role. The campaign map allows you to access different missions, both story-driven and on the side, which have various win conditions, requirements, different sets of rules, as well as different engagement sizes. So you can have small skirmishes all the way up to larger fleet engagements. So this does a great job of keeping you engaged in the campaign on a gameplay level, but it does an awesome job when it comes to world building, adherence to the existing universe and lore, and storytelling in the context of an Imperial fleet commander. Licensed games, particularly in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, run a huge risk of taking the source material too lightly or not properly understanding and presenting it. The worst case scenario is when the developer completely butchers the original lore, misuses it completely, and makes a terrible story that annoys people that enjoy media within that universe. Thankfully, Tindalos did the exact opposite of that. They adhered to the lore very well, very accurately, and the whole thing feels appropriately grimdark, as a Warhammer 40,000 title should. If you play the skirmish mode and the multiplayer, you have access to the other races as well that all have very different play styles. Chaos ships generally focus on long-range missile engagements, whereas the Orc ships, well, they're more about going forward as fast as humanly possible and ramming the opposition, which is highly entertaining. The Eldar fleet is extremely agile but very fragile, which requires a very careful playstyle of evasion and deceit. And two new races were also added in the form of DLC, the Space Marines, who have extremely strong boarding actions and very tough ships, and the Tau, who have access to extremely technologically advanced vessels, as well as the very different ships of their subservient races within their empire, which puts a really awesome twist on it. There's a lot of content to enjoy here, and I actually really like tall ship combat. So, quite a few games over the past few years, and titles that are much older than that I go back to time and again because they provide that slower, graceful, tall ship combat. It's not just the theme. I mean, I love the Age of Sail. It's fantastic to see these huge ships, these masterpieces of crafting and engineering, just laden with deck after deck, battery upon battery of guns firing broadsides at the opponent. There's a great degree of romanticism associated with that. But it's also about the sort of mechanics and the style and pace of gameplay that is involved by necessity in games like that. It's not about ships that can turn on a dime. These ships turn slowly. They have a lot of firepower, and they're generally very tough, but you have to be very careful with your decisions. If you make the wrong turn, you can't easily correct that. So that means every decision you make has a real tangible impact, and that to me makes for a good gameplay experience. Battlefleet Gothic Armada may very well not include sails, but it is tall ships in space, and that's awesome. There's not a great deal of titles that do that. There are fewer still that do it well, and to put it in a universe that I already care a great deal about gives everything far more meaningful context and makes me far more invested in the game. It also happens to look really, really good. The level of detail on the ships is absolutely phenomenal. The voice acting associated with them really pulls you into the universe as well, and there's a large variety of different ships and a good amount of customization as well. When you choose, say, a specialization for a ship, whether it be the Imperial Inquisition, or perhaps on the Chaos side, allying yourself with Khorne, Nurgle, or Tzeentch, you will see a huge aesthetic difference in the livery of the ship, as well as the overall design of the ship. And that's fantastic. That's a level of detail far beyond what I actually expected. That's a great deal of care that's been put into this title by a company that clearly gives a damn about the universe. Not only is this one of the best-looking Warhammer 40,000 titles to ever be released, with great effects, tons of ship model detail, and even nice little aspects such as themed UI, but it also happens to be one of the most in-depth in terms of gameplay for Warhammer 40,000. Really, really solid mechanics across the board, lots of variety, and I dip into it from time to time simply to do a big skirmish and watch some large ships eventually explode into useless hulks. There's really nothing more satisfying than blowing up a battleship with a salvo of torpedoes in a game like this. That feels really, really good. Number 7. Darkest Dungeon. Should such a depressing title be on the list of games that I most enjoyed in 2016? It certainly was for me. Maybe it's a perverse level of enjoyment, but there is something really compelling about the Lovecraftian-esque dungeon crawler that was brought to us by the company Red Hook Studios. This was a title I briefly dipped into in 2015 during its early access process and decided to put to the side until the full release. The reason being that I felt there was a risk that I may enjoy the full release less after playing a little bit of the game before it was finished. There's a big risk in early access games as a result of that dynamic, and it's actually why I avoid most of them. But Darkest Dungeon is one of the rare exceptions where I was able to have a lot of fun during the limited early access period, but also then come back after release and have a great time as well that was not, I felt, diminished in any way by having played it early. The game consists of two major components. The management component, which involves managing a ruined and run-down estate. You've inherited a disaster, a horror it would appear from somebody in your family prior to this, and you have to gradually rebuild this completely devastated town. The more buildings you construct, the more upgrades and options, of course, you have access to, unsurprisingly, but it's also a more fleshed out management experience because this is where you treat the ills of your recruited party members. It's a very interesting and fairly unique aspect to Darkest Dungeon in the sense that it has a big focus on the wear and tear of adventuring in horrific places. Rather than just having a group of heroes who dauntlessly soldier through every single horror that's put in front of them, these hired mercenaries are flawed and imperfect, and they will crack under the pressure of the true horrors that await them in these dark dungeons. Whether it be physical afflictions such as literal syphilis, or whether it be the afflictions of a broken mind, Darkest Dungeon presents these mercenaries as perhaps expendable tools that will eventually break down and have to be replaced. Some have criticized the game for this, suggesting that it means that these characters don't really matter, but I fundamentally disagree with that. I had the desire to heal the ills and the wounds of these people, because really, I was responsible for what was going on with them. I was responsible for all of these horrible things that had happened, and giving names to your party members is a great way to get you emotionally invested in their well-being. I tried to treat them as best I could, and if I had to discard them eventually, I would, but it's actually kind of cool to deal with these flawed characters that may very well cause you problems when you go into your next dungeon. And that's where the meat of the game lies. This dungeon crawling 4-person party RPG, which is turn-based for the most part, but involves side-scrolling exploration in which every step you take drains your resources, drains your sanity, and gets darker and darker as your torches gradually burn out. The combat in this game is very enjoyably procedural. There are a lot of decisions to make, and what I particularly enjoy about it is that it's often based on the order in which your enemies and your party are standing. This adds a really interesting dynamic of position that I have enjoyed in, say, hex-based tactics games, stuff like Fire Emblem, Shining Force, and Final Fantasy Tactics. But that's not how this game is presented. It's presented as a side-on, two-dimensional party-based RPG. And a lot of those, particularly JRPGs, don't really take positioning into account a great deal. And I think that this really enhances the strategic depth of the title and makes your decisions even more meaningful. Not to mention, a spanner can be thrown in the works because quite a few of both your abilities and the enemies involve shuffling the position of their opponent. The various different classes of both hero and enemy in this game have different abilities that can only necessarily be used from certain positions in the lineup. So you may very well want a tank class hero at the front, which is very logical, and most of his abilities are going to reflect that because they will only work in the first 2 rows. There are also situations in which you may gain a benefit from being in a certain row, and of course the further back an enemy or a hero is, the less likely an ability is going to be able to hit them. It's a very interesting logical implementation of the idea of, oh god, stand behind the tank, put your archers and your healers in the back, put your tough guys and your fighters in the front. What's awesome about that is that Darkest Dungeon tends to go beyond that and doesn't simply stick to the idea of the Holy Trinity. Various classes can actually be equipped in different ways and take on different roles depending on which skills they have at their disposal. The great thing about the combat, which augments the whole feeling of despair and facing off against an implacable and unbelievably powerful enemy, is the notion that, for the most part, the combat always remains deadly. There aren't all that many situations in which you're just going to steamroll your way through a dungeon and don't have to think about each of your actions. It's one of the issues that I've got with quite a lot of JRPGs. So many fights just come down to, I'm going to win this, so I'm just going to hit the attack button over and over and again. No. Here you have to make real decisions with which skills you use, because if you use the wrong one, it could quite literally be life and death. Now, as part of that, there is a fairly large degree of randomness. There's no doubt about it. The system has a range of damage that can happen, that it has hit chance incorporated into it, and of course there are also critical hits as well. That is something that you can criticize, and it's something that a lot of people don't like. You might be about to call me on the fact that I have said in the past that I don't like that either, and in some situations you're absolutely right, but in this case I feel like it adds to that overall feeling of despair and immersion, and they managed to cross that very thin and difficult line into the territory of losing is fun. Since permadeath is a very real aspect in a game like this, it always sucks to lose someone that you've leveled up, but the game does have ways of accelerating the process of getting back an equivalent character. You're able to recruit, say, higher level characters directly off the bat if you have certain upgrades, and the game keeps itself feeling dangerous by restricting the dungeons in which higher level characters can go into. Literally, as a result of their pride and their prominence within the group, they refuse to take on menial tasks, which I think is a nice little contrivance which allows you to avoid overpowering certain dungeons for the most part. Now, I will admit that I haven't really reached the end game in this title. It's very easy to spin your wheels in the mid-game of Darkest Dungeon, and you can argue that that is a poor thing and a design mistake, and indeed they are addressing it to some degree with an upcoming update which will involve a shorter game mode. As a result of not reaching the end game, that means that I don't necessarily have the same criticisms of it, but I still enjoyed spinning my wheels in the mid-game. I actually did. The feeling of progress in a title like this isn't so important to me, but it consistently happens anyway because of this town screen in between the dungeon crawling. You're consistently earning some sort of resource that will hopefully involve you upgrading your town. That's something that's been used in quite a lot of roguelike games, or roguelite games as of late, and it works pretty well. So you always feel like you're making some level of progress, even if you're spinning wheels in the same kind of dungeons. The thing is, I just enjoy the combat so damn much, I don't really care about that, and each delve into a dungeon is suitably challenging to me that it keeps me engaged, and I don't really ever go on autopilot in a game like Darkest Dungeon. That's the kind of thing that can get you killed. I can't end a segment on Darkest Dungeon without talking about aesthetic and sound design. There's no doubt about it. This is an absolutely beautiful game. It uses some pretty interesting artistic techniques to get a lot out of a little. This game actually doesn't have a lot of animation in it. You may not have noticed that, but if you look at it, you'll actually see that most of the attack animations consist of nothing but 2 frames. And you might think, that's terrible. But actually, it looks great, because they use perspective changes and tilt shift on these 2-dimensional, almost paper characters, along with great sound design and snappy response to give a real sense of impact and crunch to each hit. The art design on the heroes is great, but it's the monster design that really gets me. There's some truly horrific stuff in this, particularly the bosses. There's so much work that's been put into that, and it's an awesome realization of an original, though Lovecraftian-inspired universe. Of particular note, as you're probably well aware by now, is the narrator. This is a guy that, for a living, has done an awful lot of audiobook readings for actual Lovecraft books. So it made perfect sense to grab this guy, and his deep, gravelly, and dramatic voice is incredibly imposing. It's got a huge amount of presence to it, and it gives great context and gravitas to your actions, whether it be negative or positive. Strike a critical hit and slay an enemy, and he'll give you a celebratory line. You feel inspired and you can push on to success, and yet, of course, when things start to go badly, the unavoidable sense of doom is conveyed in every single line he comes up with. Overly dramatic, some might say, but I absolutely love it. If this is cheese, then laden another slice on me, because holy hell, the narration in this game is second to none. Darkest Dungeon realizes a great vision, presents a tactically deep and challenging experience, and in terms of its presentation, it is an absolute tour de force, and I greatly enjoyed my suffering in Darkest Dungeon. Number 6. Captain Sonar. It's not a video game! You can't have that! When did I say video games? Actually, I never did. I said top 10 games that I enjoyed in 2016. I believe this is the first straight-up physical board game that I've ever included in a top 10 of the year list, but I'm going to do it anyway because it is that damn good. And I couldn't possibly give a top 10 list of things that I've enjoyed without mentioning this unforgettable experience, and I really do mean that. So Captain Sonar is a 2-team, 8-player game in which each team commands a futuristic submarine. The goal of the game is a fairly simple one. Work with your teammates, your crew, to sink the other submarine before they sink you. It's played out on various different maps, which include island obstacles, and you'll probably notice that there's a battleship-like grid going on here. Yeah, you can think of Battleship a little bit, the classic game of trying to sink the other fleet before they sink you, but there's so much more to it than that. One of the most interesting and unique aspects of Captain Sonar is that the whole thing is played out in real time. Now, if you're not familiar with the massive rise in board gaming over the past few years, and your exposure to board games is limited to much older, well-known titles like, say, Monopoly or Cluedo, you probably associate board gaming with a boring family experience in which you sit around a table, each taking very slow turns, something that can drag on for ages, and doesn't require any actual skill, decision-making, or any real interaction. The stress factor, for the most part, in those classic board games comes from the family strife that arises from playing something like Monopoly. I mean, Monopoly is a bad game. I've explained why. It was deliberately designed to be a bad game down to its very core. But board gaming is way more than that. It has been for a long time, but especially over the last few years, we really have entered a golden age of board gaming. There's a huge variety available, and there's a lot of different ways to play, and Captain Sonar is a great example of that. It is done in real time. Everything is done as fast as you and your teammates can do it. The way that it works is each of the 4 players takes on a role, and they have specific responsibilities and tasks. So the captain is going to make decisions as to which systems to use and which direction to go in. It's going to say north, south, east, or west. Now, the intriguing aspect of this is that he has to give those orders loud enough for the other team's radio operator to hear. Now, once the radio operator on the opposing team hears this order, they mark down the direction of the enemy sub on a piece of acetate, a transparent plastic layer that goes over a representation of the game map. You do this quite simply with a dry erase marker pen, and you've got to try and figure out exactly where the opposing submarine is on the map based on the orders that have been given by the other team's captain. Now, your movement is governed by a set of rules. You're not able to move into squares that contain islands, for instance. And you also cannot move in a way that would make you cross your previous course. So it's like Snake in that regard. You can't cross your own tail. Now, to compound this, every time you move, something on the ship starts to break down. And the engineer is responsible for monitoring that, marking off broken systems, and telling the captain, we really shouldn't be doing this because horrible things are going to happen if we do. When the sub breaks down enough, systems will stop working and you are at risk of sinking. So you have to surface in order to do repairs. Of course, when you surface, you have to tell the other team where you are. And as you frantically try and fix the systems on the ship so you can dive once again, the other submarine is closing as fast as possible to try and get a bead on you for a torpedo strike. This game is an incredibly tense co-op experience, and I mention it in many ways because I think that it's an example that video games should be following going into 2017. I think that a lot of video games have lost the plot when it comes to cooperative gameplay, that co-op gameplay has become something that you just tick off a checklist of features in many games. It's become the throwaway multiplayer mode of yesteryear. I'm sure you remember that when it came to video games, the titles that released with a tacked-on multiplayer mode that nobody actually wanted to play and had nowhere near enough development time put into it to be worth your time. A co-op has become that de facto tacked-on mode in many titles these days, and I've tried to coin the term FOOP for a mode in which the cooperative aspect is little more than surface level. This is for games that don't have a true cooperative experience, that often involve aspects like informational asymmetry, complementary skill sets, and synergistic roles in which having more than one player really does make a difference to the gameplay because not everybody can do everything. You have to rely on the others to do it. And that's what makes co-op gameplay truly memorable. Captain Sonar is that in so many different ways, and it's a true form of cooperative game simply because you play it in person and you're put in a high-tension, high-stress situation in which you must work with the other players, and communication is key. That's what made Captain Sonar absolutely unforgettable for me this year. Just how satisfying and rewarding that cooperative experience was. It's always great to do things with friends, and many video games use that as a crutch. Everything is more fun to play with friends means that you don't have to incorporate any actual real cooperative design in there. You don't have to make a truly good co-op game because the game's just going to be better because you got more people with you. Watching paint dry is more fun with friends. That doesn't mean that watching paint dry is an inherently good cooperative experience. And this game is just the pure essence of that, and it's such a joyous, if at the time, incredibly stressful experience. The camaraderie is something that I very rarely find, and when I do discover it in the video game medium, it's great. It reminds me of old school WoW raiding. It reminds me of the first time we took down the first boss of Molten Core, which was like 10 years ago now. There's nothing quite like taking down a difficult challenge with your friends. That feels awesome. And Captain Sonar is that with an additional competitive element. Thanks to a large number of different maps as well as the unique nature of the roles, there's a ton of replayability with this. It's a simple concept overall, sub versus sub in a battle to the death. Use various systems such as drones and mines and torpedoes to win the day. But playing each role gives you a fundamentally different gameplay experience, and having different people in the game makes for a wholly different game experience. It's different every time as a result of playing with a different group. Thankfully, the game is actually quite easy to pick up. It sounds complicated, especially the real-time aspect to it, and it does have an optional turn-based mode, which is recommended for those who are initially starting out. But our group dove in headfirst with the real-time mode, and I'm very glad we did, because that's where the game truly shines. You can play it really at any skill level. Screwing up is actually part of the fun, because it is a desperate scramble versus another team that's probably just as incompetent as you are. The individual tasks aren't too difficult to pull off at all, but there's a great level of strategy in there, and as I said, the aspect of communication is so vital and a skill that you can absolutely develop and is incredibly rewarding to improve, that the game does end up having a higher skill ceiling. This is an absolutely phenomenal in-person board game. It's something that I'd recommend everybody gets to try. And honestly, it's not something that couldn't be done in video games. In fact, it could be very easily done as a video game. You could play it with a tabletop simulator program, but I'd love to see a full digital conversion of this using modern voice over IP. There's really no reason not to do that these days. The technology is there, and I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to enjoy the social aspect of gaming more and more, but I have that competitive streak as well, as a game like Captain Sonar allows for both of those things. Overall, it's a beautiful piece of simple design using basic, cheap components that's quick to set up and tear down and can produce some absolutely unforgettable times with your friends. If you remain relatively unaware of simply how incredible board gaming has got over the last few years, I would suggest that now's an awesome time to start investigating. You're gonna find an absolute treasure trove of awesome design, and many of these games can even be played as single-player experiences. You don't necessarily need a group. You certainly do for this one, but that's its strength. That's what makes it so damn good. Number 5. Plants vs. Zombies Heroes. This is a very unexpected addition to the list for me. It's not something that I saw coming, and honestly, as a spin-off to a series that I appreciated but was never really enthusiastic about, I didn't expect to put anywhere near as many hours into Plants vs. Zombies Heroes as I ended up doing. The title is a collectible card game, for all intents and purposes, but it has a significant number of changes and alterations versus the current kings of the genre at the moment to make it worth playing, even though I found myself this year in particular burned out on Hearthstone and games that were similar to it. Plants vs. Zombies Heroes features a lane-based design, in which you can place creatures just like you could in a collectible card game, and they have an attack stat, a health stat, and special effects. So far, so similar. And yet, as a result of the lane-based design, you have to think very carefully about the positioning of those creatures, because for the most part, only one creature can occupy each lane. This is a nice way of dealing with the idea that creatures need to take damage for you. In other games, you might have something like taunt or block. In this case, it's just, oh, well, it's in the way in this lane, so obviously it's going to be taking the hit first. It reduces the visual complexity of a game like this without actually reducing the mechanical complexity, so it's a neat little way of doing things. And also it invokes memories of Plants vs. Zombies, the tower defense game. It's not a case of this being a spin-off that has no relation whatsoever and doesn't really belong in the series. It actually feels like it really does belong in the series. The physical aspect of blocking lanes to stop the opposition from doing damage to you is the same principle behind Plants vs. Zombies 1 and 2, in which you built a wall of plants to stop the zombies from getting to the house. It's as simple as that. So it makes thematic sense. The other major difference compared to other titles in the genre is that this game actually includes phase-based play. There's been a recent trend, for the most part as a result of Hearthstone, to abandon the idea of phase-based play because it can be quite clunky and it can slow the game down, especially online. Problem is, of course, that involves simplification of mechanics and the removal of player interaction, which is something that not everybody enjoys. In this case, we do have phase-based design, so you are able to take an action after your opponent has taken certain actions, and there is a level of player interaction that lets you respond to something that's been done. And I enjoy that quite a bit more. To me, it makes the game feel engaging all the time, as opposed to something like Hearthstone, where as the enemy is taking their turn, you're probably just sort of sitting around trying to plot your next move, but you can't really do anything. So it affects the pacing of the game, in my opinion. Of course, phase-based design can wreck the pace of the game as well. As I said, it can be quite clunky to hand back to the other player because there's going to be a delay there, but they've reached a nice compromise between something like, say, Magic the Gathering, where a player can technically respond to pretty much any play at any time, versus something like Hearthstone, where you can't respond to any play at any time. These are the two big mechanical differences that kept me interested in this. I've played plenty of Hearthstone imitators that have tried to replicate the success and a great deal of the design. And the problem is that didn't help me get over the burnout that I've got for that game. It just ended up presenting the same problems for the most part. So I needed something in the CCG genre that differentiated itself significantly, not just aesthetically or thematically. And that's what Plants vs. Zombies Heroes does for me. It's very competent mechanically, and it's also an absolute joy to look at. The art style is quintessentially PopCap, and the creatures themselves are very well designed. They're not just static images, they're fully animated creatures that have their own death animations, attack animations, and those are very stylized and thematic as well, and they're really awesome to look at. A great example is a little plant by the name of the hibernating berry. Yes, ha ha ha, the game loves its puns. And it's what you would expect. It's a bear that's also a berry, and it's asleep, and it's snoring, it's adorable, and when it gets hit, it wakes up, and even its little attack animation is a cute as hell little sort of swipe at the enemy that's less of a, oh, I'm going to destroy you, and more of a, hey, leave me alone kind of thing. It's great. There's so much personality injected into those creatures, and a surprising amount of variety. I'm kind of shocked as to the number of different zombies you can have. They've probably gone a little too far and just said, well, okay, it's anything a human can be, plus zombie. And that's fine, though, because it's all amusing to look at. It's all so tongue-in-cheek and whimsical. You don't expect that level of polish out of a mobile spin-off. These are often cash-in games, these are often cash vampire games, designed to milk as much money out of you as possible. And while this has a free-to-play collectible model, which means, yeah, buying packs is a thing, it's surprisingly fair, even compared to genre competitors like Hearthstone. And the reason for that is there are plenty of ways to acquire the in-game premium currency, but there are also ways to purchase, should you choose, packs of cards that have specific cards in them. This vastly reduces the reliance on RNG when it comes to unpacking, and that means that you end up wasting less money, potentially. You get the things that you want, and you can spend a small amount of money by focusing on, say, just one hero type and deck. The game also includes the ability to disassemble duplicate cards or cards that you don't want in order to craft specific other cards, which is, in combination with that premium model, a much fairer system. I ended up spending a lot less money on this game than I did on Hearthstone, I can tell you that for a fact, and I felt actually like I got a lot more for my money in the process. There's always the potential that business models can get a lot more exploitative later down the line, and nowhere is that more true than on mobile devices, but at the moment it seems like it's going in the right direction, so hopefully it will continue to do that. And PopCap has a reasonable reputation when it comes to business models, even on mobile devices. They're by no means known for being an extremely exploitative company in that regard, really quite the opposite. If I have criticisms of it, it would be probably down to some of the connection unreliability. Occasionally, opponents drop from games. You do get the win for that, but it's rather annoying to interrupt a good game just because an opponent dropped out of it for whatever reason. And the game is currently lacking in different modes because it's a fairly new release. I would expect, if it does well, that it'll get a great deal of support in that regard, and there'll be different formats available and special weekly modes and so on and so forth that'll flesh the whole thing out. But the core experience right now is really, really good. It's very compelling, and I find myself playing this on a daily basis, usually for several rounds at a time. And it's probably just because the meta hasn't really settled down yet and I'm not playing at a top level, but I'm finding that experimentation in deck building is both enjoyable and viable. I'm not losing a ton of games just because I decided to deviate from a net deck list or whatever. So this is a really nice little free-to-play mobile title. Of course, you can play it on PC using the BlueStacks Android emulator, and it works totally fine with that as well. It is a vertical game, so do expect that to be an issue if you're not playing on a mobile device, but this has completely replaced Hearthstone for me on my daily play calendar, and it takes quite the game to budge that out of the way. I've spent God knows how much money and thousands of hours on Hearthstone, so for something to come in and replace that wholesale is kind of impressive. Number 4. Super Hot. Ah, yes. Here's a game that I really enjoyed this year, and it's not something that necessarily kept me playing for hundreds of hours, but I left feeling very satisfied at the end of it. This is a game based on a simple idea: time only moves when you do. As a first-person shooter, it turns the game and the genre somewhat on its head. FPS is traditionally a very reflex-dependent genre. It's something that you require reaction speed in order to play well. This is a game in which reaction speed is completely irrelevant because you can stop it at any time you like, and that shifts the focus towards decision-making, strategy, and forward thinking. In this game, you have as long as you want to assess the situation and then figure out what actions you want to take. But as soon as you start taking those actions, you set in motion this chain of events. And perhaps you may have made the wrong call earlier that results in your death later. It's an absolutely fascinating little exercise in cause and effect, but it's also extremely cool. Those of us that grew up in the Matrix generation of bullet time are probably going to appreciate this a great deal because it's a game of bullet time, except you dictate the pace of said bullet time. It's a great little piece of fantasy fulfillment as you literally dodge bullets, but at the same time, the game constitutes stylized strategy. The ability to take things at your own pace also allows for a good amount of variance in terms of playstyle, and you don't necessarily have to do things optimally. You can do things that are maybe not quite as effective, but extremely cool. Not the sort of things that you necessarily would have had to do or would have even been able to pull off were the game in real time. If you want to knock a bullet out of the air by grabbing an ashtray and throwing it for an interception, you can absolutely do that. You could probably just step out of the way of the bullet as well, but why would you not want to try something like that? That gives you that awesome feeling of escapism. You did it not because you had to, but because you wanted to. What a glorious little indulgence that is. The game itself comes with a campaign that constitutes a few hours, but upon finishing that, you start to unlock a great deal of modes that allow you to play those levels again with a wide variety of different rule sets, and that's where the longevity of the game comes for most. There is a story, and there is an overarching meta-narrative aspect to that story, but for me it wasn't really the priority. I didn't really care about that. For me, it was just a nice little bit of icing on the cake that gave the game just that little extra ounce of style on top of it. The terminal-style interface and the repeated use of the phrase super hot as it pops up on the screen over and over and over again. This idea that maybe everything is not quite what it seems. That was cool. It added to the flavor, but it was never really the priority. To me, this is just like pure mechanical joy. This is pure mechanical enjoyment. It's a simple idea taken in a wide variety of different directions that emphasizes player choice and stylish moves. While this came relatively early on in the year, and I had finished it, played a bunch of the other modes, and put it down probably within a couple of weeks, I did pick it up again recently because it has been released in a somewhat different form as Superhot VR. That is one hell of an experience, I have to say. I used the Oculus Touch controllers to play it, and when you take those awesome optional rule of cool moments, such as, again, throwing the ashtray to deflect the bullet, but you add that extra element of physicality using motion-based controls and then immerse yourself in a full-on VR experience, it takes on an entirely different level of immersion. That, to me, is Superhot taken to its logical conclusion. I don't think I've played anything up to this point that has made you feel like more of an action hero than Superhot in VR. It's absolute bliss. It is just true mechanical satisfaction. Everything that you do makes you feel great inside. And I think there's this real sense of purity that runs throughout the whole product, whether it be the clean visual look, whether it be the minimalistic sound design, or its no-frills approach to the dedication to that time-only moves when you do mechanic. It's getting all the juice out of a single fruit. It's getting every last piece of potential out of an idea. Superhot may very well not be a game that you keep on your hard drive all year long and play on a daily basis, but when it comes to quality of time spent, there have been very few titles over the last couple of years that come close. Number 3. Civilization 6. There's something of a rough rule of thumb when it comes to Civ games, and that's you're probably best waiting for at least the first expansion. It's not a universally true rule by any stretch of the imagination. We've had quite a few Civ titles that have been great on release, but recently that's not really been the case. Civilization 5 and Civilization Beyond Earth are the two main culprits of this problem, and the issue is twofold. The first being that both Civ 5 and Civ Beyond Earth had pretty significant technical problems on launch, which is a very objective reason to say, oh, for God's sake, wait before you buy it. But the other issue is something that's just inherent to the whole Civilization series, in that it's such a complicated set of games that has so many mechanics and so many layers that the latest edition of a Civ game is probably not going to have as many features as the previous version of the game plus its expansion packs. This often results in launch versions of Civilization games feeling like they've taken a big step forward but then 2 steps back, and you're waiting for at least an expansion to catch it up to the features of the previous, or maybe it simply comes down to the idea that they've cut a feature that you liked from the previous title and they're then going to reintroduce it after they've reworked it later on. The great thing about Civilization 6 is that it didn't feel that way. It felt like at launch it was a complete experience that wasn't missing anything significant, at least not in my eyes. There are of course systems that are not there that were present in previous titles. Corporations is a good example of that, for instance. But the features that they do have feel like they're so well implemented and so well fleshed out that they've hit all the major beats, that they haven't missed any key part of the Civilization experience. Now, the other side of that is that it doesn't feel simply like a rehash of previous games. They've got enough radical differences and departures in design philosophy to make Civ 6 stand out already without expansions versus the previous games. That's another reason why it's often not necessarily worth upgrading, quote-unquote, immediately to the latest version of a franchise. The older version's still good. It may very well be better, so you might as well stick with that for a while. I didn't feel that way with Civilization 6, and it felt familiar enough to me that I was able to grasp how to play it very quickly, and I didn't have to completely relearn the whole thing, but there were so many cool, significant changes that I felt like it was a whole new game experience. It tapped the same veins that previous Civ games did. I got the same kind of enjoyment out of it, but the new systems that were there to master made the game feel fresh again. One of the best examples of that is the way that they have done districts. This radically changes the city building dynamic that was present in most Civilization games. For the most part, Civ games have self-contained cities. The entire city will be contained in a single block, and it will consist of a list of stuff that's in it. Sometimes there'll be visual and aesthetic changes to the city, but for the most part, there is no square or, in recent cases, hex-based sprawl at all. That always felt a little bit weird to me. And the way that they've done it this time is they've broken out aspects of the city onto surrounding hexes, which means that a city sprawls over a larger area of territory. Wonders must now be built outside of the city proper, which visually is great, thematically is fantastic, and presents some interesting challenges when it comes to space management. And they also have something called districts, which is a way of taking aspects of a city, whether it be its research capabilities, its cultural capabilities, its industrial buildings, and placing it outside of the city hex, but within the territory as part of that overall sprawl. If you place an industrial zone, you will then get the option, assuming you have the tech, to construct buildings within that zone. This, in my eyes, vastly improves the aspect of city planning within Civilization and gives you a more visual way to see what exactly your city is designed to do. It also introduces a satisfying puzzle-like element in which you have to commit some pretty heavy forward planning to the construction of your cities, taking into account the terrain surrounding it. This was always something that was a part of Civilization, but in this case, it's been emphasized a heck of a lot more because certain districts benefit from being adjacent to terrain elements or other kinds of district. Now, bearing in mind that you have limited space around your city to construct these and that they get progressively more expensive as you build more of them, you do have to specialize somewhat. These global cost increases tend to do a little to rein in the city spam idea of just throwing cities all over the map and not really putting any individual care and attention into them. I much more enjoyed spending that extra time with city planning. It was a whole lot more satisfying to play. I could go on for hours knocking on every little feature that Civilization 6 has, and I've spent a good amount of time already doing that in other videos and during lengthy live streams, so there's no real need to recap a huge amount of it there. I just wanted to highlight possibly the feature that I enjoyed the most. But as an overall package, it looks great and it sounds great. The massive library of music in the soundtrack that covers a whole host of different cultures and eras is fantastic. It does a great job of setting the scene and gives that overall feeling of optimism that Civilization has been known for in the past. I didn't really think that anybody could really replace the late great Leonard Nimoy, but Sean Bean does a pretty damn good job as the technology narrator for the title, describing each technological and cultural advancement with some interesting and relevant quote. I was able to easily sink a ton of time into Civilization 6 this year and got a lot of enjoyment out of it, and I'm very much enjoying starting new playthroughs as well, which is something that in some previous Civilization games I was a little wary of. I think it was down to the idea that I'd invested so much time in the previous playthrough that starting again felt like I was really throwing progress away, but I don't really feel that way with Civilization 6. I will say that it is by no means a perfect game. It's received quite a lot of criticism for AI problems early on, and they have started to resolve those. It's a better game than it was on launch. But I have to say that these issues are inherent to Civilization as a series. Almost every Civilization game on launch has had some pretty damn serious issues, and AI has always been a problem. It's just a very, very complex game. It's been described by some people as like one of the biggest digital board games that exist, and they're kind of right in that respect. There's just rules upon rules upon rules upon rules, and it is difficult to create a truly challenging AI that acts as if it was a real person that can properly interact with you diplomatically, make sensible decisions, and react in a way that can surprise you but is simultaneously sensibly predictable and isn't completely erratic. There are some issues with that, no doubt. That those are numbers that need to be tweaked, those are systems that need to be overhauled. The game can and has room to get better, but as a base product, as something that is definitely flawed, but at its core a very well-designed and feature-rich game, Civilization 6 ate up a ton of my time in 2016, and I really got an awful lot out of playing it. We can only hope to see official mod tools coming in the near future, more patches and updates to make it into an even better game, but I think that as it stands, it has the potential to be the best Civilization game ever. I really hope it's able to realize that potential. As it stands, though, it's just a damn good Civ game. Number 2. Doom. You knew it was coming. You've heard an awful lot about Doom over the past 12 months from me, whether it be initial negativity and skepticism, a pretty damn negative reaction to the multiplayer beta, exasperation with publisher Bethesda when it came to getting access to the game prior to launch, and on the complete flip side of that, the sheer visceral joy that I was able to experience from the single-player campaign. Doom has elicited a wide range of emotions from me, and it's got a good amount of attention all over the games industry for a very, very good reason, as well as a couple of bad ones. Doom's campaign may very well be one of the finest first-person shooters we have seen in years. I don't think that's hyperbole, and I don't really think that's a controversial or contrarian statement in any way. This is a game by the masters of their art, id Software. A game that came from a studio that developed arguably the best and certainly most influential first-person shooters of all time, but over the past few years hasn't been able to repeatedly realize that level of success. They've put out a couple of titles that were not as well received. Games like Rage, which certainly had some excellent parts to it, but was criticized rightly in a wide variety of ways. And of course, Doom 3, which was a fundamentally different game from Doom 1 and 2, and some people really enjoyed, and was certainly impressive on a technical level, but some people believed was too much of a departure from Doom 1 and 2, just missing the soul of what made those games great. To say that Doom is a phenomenal return to form would be an understatement, at least when it comes to the single-player gameplay. Doom is a no-nonsense monument to the purity of the first-person shooter genre. There's no fluff, it's a no-frills game. Its focus is to get an adrenal response out of you. Its focus is to suck you into the first-person shooter trance, that rhythmically punctuated tunnel vision, that unwavering focus when it comes to engaging in that moment-to-moment combat. That's something that Doom does better than maybe any other first-person shooter in the genre over the past 10 years. At its core, Doom is a very simple game with a very simple concept. There are demons, kill the demons. But that really doesn't do it justice, because commitment to simplicity can be just as good and sometimes even better than layers upon layers of complexity, because it often represents honesty, it often represents credibility, and it often represents design integrity, a singular, focused, well-realized vision. Some might decry that kind of thing as dumb, some might decry that kind of thing as corny, as something that the medium has evolved past, but that's clearly not true at all. You don't evolve past great mechanics, you don't evolve past awe-inspiring, gloomy visuals, you don't evolve past magnificent gameplay. Make no mistake about it, that's what Doom's single-player campaign is. It's a really well-paced first-person shooter across varied and well-designed maps with a brutal, visceral, and adrenaline-inducing approach to combat. Its gunplay may very well be second to none. Animation quality is through the roof. The punchy, powerful effect of every gun in your arsenal is punctuated by both its audio and visual design. Enemies satisfyingly come apart, the walls are painted in the gore of your fallen foes, and ripping a hellbeast apart with a chainsaw has never been more satisfying. Some might describe Doom as a throwback. I don't necessarily think that that's true, I just feel like there are bits of its DNA which come from a simpler time by necessity, and yet to see that reimagined in 2016 proves the viability of that DNA, that while we don't have those limitations anymore, the ideas are still really solid. Do a few things, do them really, really well, tie them together with a vision that has no creases, that has no visible seams. Don't necessarily be tied down by modern game design conventions, just do what you think is a good idea based on your previous experience. That's what id did, that's id's identity. Now, I'm gonna be honest, if I were to assess Doom as a complete product, and this list were perhaps pretending to be more objective than it is, I probably would not have placed this anywhere near as highly. It may not have even made the list at all. The reality of it is that Doom has three components: the single-player campaign, the multiplayer mode, and snap map. And the multiplayer component in particular is not up to the quality of the single-player campaign by any stretch of the imagination. It's not bad. I did get some enjoyment out of it, but it's by no means a genre beater, and There's a reason why there's not all that many players for it anymore. Snap Map as well has a reasonable amount of power behind it, but it is quite tricky to use beyond the basic level, and the restrictions imposed upon it as a result of the simultaneous console release mean that creating entirely brand new game modes that have an awful lot of complexity to them is a bit difficult compared to, say, a full suite of mod tools. It's not an adequate replacement for that. Here's the thing, though, that's not what the list is based on at all. It's based purely on what I enjoyed the most, and despite the fact that the multiplayer component isn't up to the standard of the single player, and looking at it as a value proposition, it isn't Game of the Year material. But none of that matters, because I told you exactly what I was basing this list on when we started this video. If you've forgotten that, feel free to go back to the start. I enjoyed the single player a hell of a lot. That's the reality of it. I don't think there's been any game over the past couple of years that has elicited as much of a guttural sense of enjoyment from me. Doom's single player campaign just uncorks pure gaming passion. It made me forget. It allowed me to escape. And it immersed me so thoroughly that for the length and breadth of its campaign, I was just having fun all the time. I was getting engrossed in that trance time and time and time again, and grinning to myself from ear to ear. If you've watched the stream VOD, you know what my reaction was. There's no way to fake that. It was one of surprise, and it was one of pure honest-to-God raw enjoyment. That's good enough for me. That's a reason to put it at number 2 on this list as far as I'm concerned, and the recent addition of the free DLC, which unlocked a new score-focused arcade mode, is a reason to go back and play it again. It already had a little bit of replayability, now it has a hell of a lot more. I also have to say that the Doom Guy, or the Doomslayer, is maybe one of my favorite characters over the last couple of years, because he acts in exactly the way that you would expect somebody with those characteristics to act in that situation. He's as raw and as honest as the game is itself, and Doom 2016 is a hell of a shooter, and it's going to be difficult to top over the next couple of years, unless the thing to beat it is developed by id themselves. Number 1. XCOM 2. In my opinion, the best game of the year came out pretty damn early in 2016, released on February the 5th for Firaxis XCOM 2, the successor to their interpretation of XCOM Enemy Unknown, was an absolute time vampire for me. It was one of the only games that I had the time and inclination to finish. No, let's not use the term inclination, let's use the term compulsion. I felt compelled to finish it. It was that good from start to finish, and that's certainly not a short game. My playtime for XCOM 2 for the first playthrough was clocking in above 60 hours. It's a lot of game, and it takes a lot of time to beat, because frankly it's pretty damn difficult, and you probably should take your time, otherwise you will make fatal mistakes. XCOM 2 is such a massive advancement over the first version of Firaxis' interpretation of XCOM that in my eyes it's one of the most impressive sequels of the last few years, not just a really impressive game. You take the core ideas of the first one, certainly, and they remain present here, but they overhauled basically every system. They introduced tons of new features and new mechanics, and they ramped everything up to 11. Right across the board, see? They made it 11. Their approach to design here was not just refinement. They weren't taking a scalpel to the game. They roided the game up. They created a monster. It's 3 times the game of the original, at least in my opinion. Everything's more powerful. More skills available for your troops, more technology available, and yet that also means more enemies, and those enemies having greater capabilities. Ramping everything up ramps up the tension. It ramps up the willingness to keep playing because it keeps the game fresh. It keeps the variety. While XCOM kind of sputtered out, in my opinion, about halfway through the campaign and ran out of new ideas to surprise you with, XCOM 2 keeps surprising you up until the absolute very end. The final mission is itself also full of surprises. That's a large part of what made it so consistently compelling for me, I think. I very much enjoyed the change of perspective in XCOM 2 versus the original. Rather than a government agency that had been created to fight against the growing alien menace, XCOM 2 said, you lost. I mean, of course you did. You got absolutely crushed. And 20 plus years later, what remains of XCOM is a ragtag group of resistance fighters using stolen alien technology, infiltration, subterfusion, guerrilla tactics. The mechanics of the game are fundamentally altered to incorporate this. It's not just a thematic twist. The addition of the infiltration phase is something that is both a really great refinement and an awesome new addition. It certainly makes you feel like a guerrilla group as you slowly sneak in and infiltrate the area using stealth tactics, but it has the effect of increasing the speed at which you get to the action. It has the effect of reducing the downtime, it increases the pace of the game, and it improves that dramatically as far as I'm concerned. It also happens to be an interesting answer of one of the criticisms of the first game, this idea of pod-based gameplay where you pull one group at a time. They haven't quite got rid of that, but they introduced this mechanic to help mitigate that and lessen the overall impact so that you could take a more aggressive approach as opposed to creeping very, very, very slowly from the very start. The whole game has a greater sense of momentum as well as a good deal of tension as the doomsday clock ticks away. Your base is mobile, you're not defending static areas on the map anymore, you're not worried about the approval of countries, you're trying to make contacts again, you're trying to build up a network of resistance. That presents an almost overwhelming number of decisions, certainly, but it does help start from a position in which your scope is narrow, focused, and manageable, and you're able to expand out from there on in. Plus, who the hell doesn't like the idea of a flying base? Character classes are vastly more distinct versus the original, with psychic troopers, rangers that are able to engage in melee combat. There's a big variety of perks and progression options for your troops. They don't just get standard issue gear upgrades either, no. In keeping with the theme of a ragtag group using what they can find, and also a focus on the individual, you've now got a loot system which allows you to acquire modifications for your weapons, so you can customize each of them individually, both in terms of their performance and role, as well as visually. There's a lot of visual customization that's been added in as well, and you might think that's not so important in a turn-based tactics game, but honestly in XCOM, where naming your troops and developing a backstory, as well as creating new war stories every time you bring them on a mission and they either survive or fall in the defense of Earth, was one of the key strengths of the original, and it's been expanded hugely in XCOM 2 thanks to all of those cosmetic options. You can even export rosters and have certain characters appear as NPCs, a lovely little feature there. Now, the launch product was pretty damn good and it was stuffed full of content, but the amount of content the game has now is ludicrous. The game had official mod support right out of the gate, and going one step further than that, the development house brought in Long War Studios, the guys responsible for the Long War mod for the original XCOM Enemy Unknown, and said, make us official mods. As a result, there have been about 5 or 6 released by Long War Studios over the past year, which include new enemy types, a vast selection of new perks, which completely change the performance and skills of your troops. They've added in a brand new layer of technology, a new tier of weapons, and those are all free professionally produced mods on top of the DLC that's also available for it, which expands the game even further. It almost feels like there's too much when you add all of those things in together, but it's great for replayability. It gives you another reason to get going on yet another playthrough. There's so much to do and so much to see. Just to up the ante even further, it goes to 12 now, see, right across the board. There is now the announcement of a Long War 2 mod, an incredibly hard, legendary mod, of course by Long War Studios for the original Enemy Unknown, is now being brought to XCOM 2 with all that entails. So, yet again, another reason to do a playthrough. That's a lot of game for your $60 if you happen to be into the turn-based tactical nature of it. Now, there is an aspect that I would like to address, which is a negative, because I've basically just given Game of the Year to a title that on quite a few systems had and still has performance problems on PC. That is a very fair criticism. And you might say, how could you possibly do this? As a PC-focused channel, how could you give Game of the Year to a title that has performance problems for some people and continues to have those to this very day? Well, the answer to that really being that this isn't Game of the Year, it just happens to be the game that I enjoyed the most this year. Now, in terms of those performance issues, I didn't really experience them all that much. I certainly did during the final mission, I'll tell you that for a fact. The game definitely chugged at that point. The performance has improved with patches over the course of time, but the game ran reasonably well for me pretty much all the time. It didn't run brilliantly, I will say that, but it is worth bearing in mind this is a turn-based strategy game. Frame rate matters always, in all genres, in all games. There are no exceptions to this rule. However, the degree to which frame rate and performance matters, that is something that varies on a genre-by-genre and game-by-game basis. One of the genres that is least affected by lower frame rates is the turn-based tactics genre. It doesn't affect your ability to aim, shoot, or really play. It's frustrating and it doesn't look good, but it doesn't impede your enjoyment anywhere near as much as it would in, say, a first-person shooter, where for me it doesn't just impede my enjoyment, it nukes it from orbit. My personal experience with the game is not a valid reason to dismiss criticism of the way that XCOM 2 performs. This is still something that needs to be addressed by Firaxis, no doubt about it. Firaxis do not have a sterling reputation when it comes to performance of products, which is odd considering their focus on PC and again on turn-based titles, but then again maybe that's the reason. Because they are focused on turn-based games, they are less focused on making sure frame rate stays high all the time because it's less essential. That's not really an excuse, but I guess you can at least see some sort of justification there. Regardless, I feel it is important to mention it. Despite the fact that I enjoyed this more than anything else this year, and despite the fact that I wasn't really affected by the performance issues because they didn't really materialize in any severe degree for me, that doesn't mean that it's not worthy of a mention. So I'll put that out there. That's my reason for that, that's my excuse. People can dispute that all they wish and say that a game doesn't deserve to be in number one if it has significant performance issues. And they are entirely entitled to that opinion, and as far as I'm concerned, that opinion is valid. It just doesn't apply to my list of games that I enjoyed the most. As it stands, XCOM 2 took up a lot of time early in the year, and I think it, even at the time, was looking like a real Game of the Year candidate. It's interesting that a title that was released so early in 2016 was the title that remained my top Game of the Year. There were games that came close, as you've seen from this list. Nothing can match it, though. I enjoyed the original XCOM games decades ago. I think that Firaxis' approach to the remake of a storied and classic series of games has certainly not been without its flaws, and I do disagree with some of the design philosophy behind it. However, I think that at this point, with XCOM 2 in its current state, Firaxis has absolutely made the series their own and has a legitimate claim to say that their game is the definitive version of the franchise. That is very controversial. Lots of people are going to argue with that one, but I can't argue with how much I liked it. And I can't argue with how much I respect the idea of turning up the power on everything, increasing complexity, and not being afraid that it would overwhelm the player. More choices, more options, more decisions to make. That's XCOM 2. Reimagined, reworked, completely rebuilt, and an unbelievably good turn-based strategy title. Easily the game that I've enjoyed the most this year, and hopefully a game that has a bright future going into 2017. If we do get an XCOM 3, though, what I will say is either ditch the multiplayer mode or vastly rework it, because it is a waste of space. It could be good, but right now it's not, and it wasn't the last time you tried it either. XCOM 2, ladies and gentlemen, stands at number 1 of the top 10 games that I enjoyed in 2016. If you're wondering where Overwatch is, you might want to check my top 10 games of 2015. An odd situation, the most enjoyment that I got out of that was before it came out. And that remains the case, I think. So there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If you did not, the dislike button is right over there. If you disagree with my entirely subjective opinions, you mash that dislike button if it makes you feel better. Feel free to share it, argue over it, do whatever you want. Just be nice to each other. We're all here to enjoy video games, yes? I'll see you next time.